everyone, I'm Nizzahon, and it is currently Core Set 2019 Full Set Limited Review Week here on my channel. So far we've covered all of the single-colored cards in the entire set. In this video we're going to look at the last few cards in the set, which are the multicolored cards, the artifacts, and the lands. I'm going to talk about my opinions about these cards for the upcoming Core Set 2019 limited format. While this is the last video sort of covering the entire set, I do have more videos coming out, such as one on the archetypes in the set and one on the best commons and uncommons in the set, so keep your eyes open for those, and of course draft videos in a few weeks once it's on Magic Online. I use a letter grade system to grade these. If you want to see how it is I come up with these letter grades and what they mean, you can find a link in the description below explaining my grading process. Now, let's get started with our first card, which is Aerial Engineer. So Aerial Engineer is a signpost uncommon. We get these in most sets these days. They're two colored cards that sort of indicate which direction you're supposed to go in with a specific archetype. In this case, this card is telling you let's go with artifacts. So it's two generic, a white and a blue for a 2/4 human artificer at uncommon, and as long as you control an artifact, Aerial Engineer gets +2/+0 and has flying. A 4-mana 2/4 isn't a horrendous floor, and in the blue-white color pair this will be a 4/4 pretty easily. Getting 5 artifacts in this color pair will usually be worth it because you'll have so many other artifact payoffs. Still, this one is a bit of a build-around and won't really be the kind you want to splash most of the time, since blue-white is really the only color pair with artifact synergies. As a result, I don't think you want to first pick this, but if you end up in blue-white, you're going to be pretty happy to be playing this. You'll play it in all your blue-white decks. For me, that means it's sort of like a C+, because a B- range is where you start considering a card to be like a good first pick, but it does have a ceiling of like a B. Let's say you get 5 or 6 artifacts, it probably gets to be a B. Next we have Arcades, the Strategist, which is 1 generic mana, 1 green, 1 white, and 1 blue for a 3/5 Elder Dragon, a legendary one at Mythic Rare. It has flying and it has vigilance. It says whenever a creature with Defender enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card, and each creature you control with Defender assigns combat damage equal to its toughness rather than its power and can attack as though it didn't have Defender. So it's kind of weird. Our first of 5 Elder Dragons we're looking at in the set, this one is sort of underwhelming. It's kind of weird to me that it's a Defender build around. It sort of signals to me that they were sort of thinking more about EDH here than they were about Limited, which is fine. But it just seems, compared to some of the other Elder Dragons, it seems a little weird. It's still a 4-mana 3/5 with Flying and Vigilance, which is great stats. But the difficulty is taking full advantage of this. I don't even think this is worth splashing for in most cases, despite the reasonable stats, because 3 colors of mana is hard to do in Limited, and hard enough that you want a bigger payoff than this. Sure, if you end up with a few creatures with Defender, it moves up a bit, but that's just not going to happen often enough. I think this Elder Dragon is just a C+. Don't go out of your way for it, like we're going to see you should do for some of the other Elder Dragons. Just play it if you happen to have a good mana base that can cast it, and you're already playing these 3 colors. Building a Defender build-around deck isn't really going to work out very well. There are, a few walls in this set, but most of them aren't very good. So, and you're not always going to draw Arcades, so it's not the greatest plan. But it does look like a fun EDH general. Next, we have Brawl Bash Ogre, which for 2 generic, a black, and a red is a 3/3 Ogre Warrior at uncommon. It has Menace, and when it attacks, you can sacrifice a creature, and if you do, it gets +2/+2 until end of turn. So this is the signpost uncommon for black-red, which is about sacrificing stuff. A 4-mana 3/3 Menace isn't bad, and you can make it a 5/5 if you sacrifice a creature, but you need to either be making creature tokens or stealing your opponent's creatures, which red can do, for that to be worth it most of the time. You can also sacrifice creatures with graveyard, graveyard synergy, creatures who when they die give you stuff. And when you do that, it'll be strong, but I just don't think you'll be able to do that often enough for it to be the kind of card that really says, hey, I want to be in this color pair. And I think it's another signpost uncommon that you don't first pick. I think it's just a C+. Next we have Chromium, the Mutable, which for 4 generic, a blue, a white, and a black is a 7/7 Elder Dragon at uncommon. It has Flash, can't be countered, has flying, and you can discard a card, and until end of turn, Chromium the Mutable becomes a human with base power and toughness 1/1, loses all abilities, and gains hexproof, and it can't be blocked this turn. So this is a strong Elder Dragon. 7 mana is a lot, but it's 7 mana for a 7/7 flyer with Flash. That means that when it comes into play, it's almost always going to kill something that it blocks. On top of that, it's difficult to deal with as long as you hold on to cards, because it can make itself hexproof whenever it needs to. I like the design here, as obviously just gaining hexproof with a discard would be nuts, so making the creature shrink itself down is a cool design, though it does become unblockable, and there may be times when that actually matters. It might be kind of cool to discard a card, shrink it, and then put an aura on this. I don't know, that seems fun, but I don't think that'll happen very often. You'll always play this if you're in these 3 colors, and I would say that if you open this pack one, pick one, 7 mana or not, 3 colors or not, you should pick it in a lot of scenarios because the power level is so high, and that makes it an A- for me. Next, we have Draconic Disciple, which for 1 generic, a red and a green, is a 2/2 human shaman at uncommon. It can tap to add 1 mana of any color, and you can pay 7 generic and tap it to sacrifice it and create a 5/5 red dragon creature token with flying. This is a signpost uncommon that I think you do want to first pick. Why? Well, because it's going to be good in any red-green deck you end up in. Whether you have synergies with some of the other stuff going on in red-green, it doesn't matter. This will be good in any red-green deck you end up in. Fixing is always great, so is ramping, and on top of that, why not? In the late game, this can turn into a giant dragon. I can see myself first picking this signpost uncommon, and I'm giving it a B-. Next, we have Enigma Drake, which for 1 generic, a blue and a red, is a star 4 Drake at uncommon. It has flying, and its power and toughness is equal to the number of instant and sorcery cards in your graveyard. So here's the signpost uncommon for blue-red spells. It's actually one we saw a few sets ago. It requires some significant commitments to be good. Your average limited deck is only going to have 3 or 4 instants and sorceries, and that just isn't enough. If you're in blue-red, your average number of instants and sorceries should go up because you have additional synergies for them, but you definitely need to be heavy on them to make this work. When you get there, it does give you a pretty scary threat, but this isn't the kind of gold card I want to first pick. You pick it up after you're already blue-red, and it looks like you've got enough spells to make it work, and for me, that makes it a C+. Next, we have Heroic Reinforcements, which for 2 generic, a red and a white, is an uncommon sorcery. And you create 2 1/1 white soldier creature tokens. Until end of turn, creatures you control get +1/+1 and haste. So, on its own, this makes 2 2/2 tokens with haste. That's a pretty good deal for 4 mana. Obviously, the wider your board gets, the more ridiculous this gets, and red and white do have ways of making tokens and really punishing the opponent with this. It has something that most mass pump spells don't have, too. Again, it does something if you have no board presence, which adding that to a mass pump spell is pretty awesome. I think basically any red-white deck will play this, and if you see this card, it should sort of shove you into going into a really aggressive go-wide red-white deck because it's so strong. Every red-white deck is going to have creatures in it. It doesn't have the same deck-building requirements a lot of the other signposts do. It is better in a deck that can make tokens and stuff, but any deck with like 15 creatures in it is going to love this card. As a result, I'm happy to first pick this. I'm giving it a B-. Next, we have Nicol Bolas the Ravager, who for 1 generic, a blue, a black, and a red, is a 4/4 Elder Dragon at Mythic Rare. He has flying. When he enters the battlefield, each opponent discards a card, and you can pay 4 generic, a blue, a black, and a red to exile Nicol Bolas and return him to the battlefield transformed, and he can only play this ability as a sorcery. When he does return transformed, he is a ridiculous planeswalker, Nicol Bolas the Arisen, who has 7 loyalty. He can do a +2 that draws you 2 cards, a -3 that does 10 damage to a creature or planeswalker, a -4 that lets you reanimate a creature or planeswalker, and a -12 that exiles all but the bottom card of target player's library. So on the front, he's not incredible. I mean, he would be if you're monocolored, right? A 4-mana 4/4 that makes your opponent discard a card and has flying, but for 4 mana, he's a little difficult. And none of his colors are green either, so there's not a little bit of ease there because you have more fixing than most people. But he's still pretty incredible. When he transforms, he's insane. I don't see opponents really being able to win the game if you transform Nicol Bolas, and that's assuming Nicol Bolas on the front doesn't just kill them. Finding a way to lose the game after you flip him is a pretty hard thing to do. He comes with the things that make planeswalkers strong: card draw and removal. You'll play him if you can play these 3 colors, and you should try pretty hard to play him, which means I think you take him pack 1, pick 1, and see if you can pick up the necessary fixing to make it work, because he's just going to end games for you. Both sides can do it. Obviously, flipping him's ideal, but it does cost 7 mana, so you're not always going to get there, but when you do, it's going to be pretty awesome. And I think this is an A-. Next, we have Palladia-Mors, the Ruiner, which for 3 generic, a red, a green, and a white, is a 6/6 Elder Dragon at Mythic Rare. It has flying, vigilance, and trample, and it has hexproof if it hasn't dealt damage yet. So a 6 mana, 6/6 with flying, vigilance, and trample, even across 3 colors, especially when one of those colors is excellent at fixing, green. That would already be a pretty good card. Add to that the fact that she has hexproof until she deals damage, and she gets even better. Sure, the hexproof likely won't last long, but your opponent will have their turn and not be able to kill her immediately in most cases, and that means you'll get a hit in at minimum thanks to that keyword. This is the last of the Elder Dragons that I think you should first pick when you see it. It's just that powerful. If you're in 2 of these colors and you open it pack 2, pick 1, which I think is true of all 3 of the Elder Dragons I gave A- to, you should think about trying to find a way to fix it. They're all just the three of them are just that good. We talked about one that's not so good, and we'll talk about another one shortly, but this one is an A-. Next, we have Poison Tip Archer, which for 2 generic, a green and a black, is a 2/3 elf archer at uncommon. It's got reach, it's got death touch, and whenever another creature dies, each opponent loses 1 life. So the Signpost uncommon from black-green here is a really good card. 4 mana, 2/3 with reach and death touch is already a good one. Added to that is the fact that it does a bit of damage over the course of the game with its static ability. But honestly, most of this card's value is in those 2 keyword abilities. I think this is a B- and a gold card to consider taking with the first pick. It doesn't do anything like crazy synergistic, but in a way that makes it almost a better first pick because you can splash it for one thing if you really want to. And it's going to be good in your black-green deck whether you get the synergies that are in that color pair or not. And, you know, sometimes the synergistic things it's supposed to do is, you know, you're supposed to have creatures dying, getting them back from the graveyard and stuff like that, and that'll happen, but it's just a good card on its own. It doesn't need anything else, and for that reason, I think it's worth considering spending a first pick on in some weaker packs. Next, we have Psychic Symbiont, which for 4 generic, a blue and a black, is a 3/3 Nightmare Horror at uncommon. It has flying, and when it enters the battlefield, target opponent discards a card and you draw a card. This is a 3-for-1, and you know I love those. It's a 6 mana 3/3 with flying. That's not great, but making your opponent lose a card while you draw one, and then having a 3/3 flyer that can be attacking in the air, all of that together is great, and I hope I get to play a lot of these. It reminds me of Dinrova Horror, though obviously it's not quite as good. It's another Signpost uncommon I would consider first picking, and I think maybe in a vacuum, like in a deck with no synergy whatsoever, it might be the best of the Signpost uncommons in this set. I'm willing to just give it a solid B. I'm really happy to spend a first pick on it. You know, it just 3-for-1s are just going to win you the game in limited over time, and that's what this is. And there's no problem with that. So next we have Regal Bloodlord, which for 3 generic, a white and a black, is a 2/4 Vampire Soldier at uncommon. It's got flying, and at the beginning of each end step, if you gain life this turn, create a 1/1 black-back creature token with flying. So this is a Signpost uncommon for black-white, which is interested in gaining life. The good news is there's tons of ways to gain life in this set. They really did a good job of supporting this archetype. There are a bunch of random cards, like cards that kill a creature and gain you life. Little incidental sources of life gain where you don't have to be really pushing the life gain. And so you're going to end up, I think you end up with like 5 cards that gain you life in your typical black-white deck anyway, because that color pair has a decent amount of like life link, a decent amount of spells that gain you life and stuff like that. And as a result, I think this is actually pretty first pickable despite asking for certain deck building requirements. I think making bats with it won't be that hard, and if you get crazy with life gain, then this gets to be completely insane because the army of bats you'll get is amazing. I think I would consider first picking this, and I'm giving it a B-. Next, we have Satyr Enchanter, which for 1 generic, a green and a white, is a 2/2 Satyr Druid at uncommon, and whenever you cast an enchantment spell, draw a card. So this is another Signpost uncommon that asks you for some considerable deck building requirements, and for me that disqualifies it from being the kind you nab with a first pick in most cases. Still, green and white both have a lot of other synergy with enchantments, so this will be good in that color pair. But it is the kind of card you pick up when you're already there on enchantments. It doesn't convince you to go into the color pair, at least not super early, since you can't know if you will get enough enchantments to make it worth it. I think that makes him another C+. Next we have Skyrider Patrol, which for 2 generic, a green and a blue, is a 2/3 uncommon elf scout with flying. At the beginning of combat on your turn, you can pay a green and a blue, and when you do, you put a +1/+1 counter on another target creature you control, and that creature gains flying until end of turn. So, if you know me, you know I love blue-green, and Skyrider Patrol gives us another very sweet blue-green Signpost uncommon. A 4 mana 2/3 with flying is almost reasonable on the vanilla test, but what makes this super strong is the fact that it not only gives creatures +1/+1 counters, it gives whatever creature it puts the counter on flying too. That's insane. Sure, there's a mana investment here, but that effect will take over games, making this come pretty close to being a full-blown bomb despite being uncommon. If it could put the counter on itself, it would be probably full-blown like A- bomb territory, but because it can't, instead it's just a solid B. It's another gold card that I think you should be pretty happy first picking. It's worth noting blue-green seems to be sort of a weird, interesting archetype that we haven't seen before really in this format, and that is that it wants to grant big creatures evasion, basically, and that's what Skyrider Patrol does, obviously. So it fits well into the archetype, and it's not an archetype that's super synergistic or anything. You just need to be in blue and green and have some creatures, and then this gets to be insane. Our last gold card is the last Elder Dragon, and that is Vivictus Asmati the Dire, which for 3 generic, a black, a red, and a green is a 6/6 Elder Dragon at Mythic Rare with flying. It's a 6/6 whenever it attacks, for each player, you get to choose a permanent that player controls. Those players then sacrifice those permanents, and each player who sacrificed a permanent this way reveals the top card of their library, then puts it onto the battlefield if it's a permanent card. So, kind of underwhelmed here. A 6-mana 6/6 flyer is obviously good, and green is one of the colors that can splash really easily, so it won't be very hard to. But this huge block of text is kind of weird. You and your opponent both sacrifice things, and yes, you at least get to decide what gets sacrificed, but you know what? You don't get to decide what's on top of your opponent's library. There are going to be times where you basically help your opponent out, and you don't get a whole lot out of the ability yourself. I think this is a C+. I mean, I think it's still pretty good because it's huge. You get to decide what they sacrifice. You know, if you're making them trade in their bomb for like a 3/3, that's going to feel good. But there's just going to be times where this just does not go the way you want it to. And I think they're going to happen more frequently than you think. I wish it said May. If it said May, this card would be considerably better because I guess that would be too good because you could only be using the ability on yourself. But still, I think it's a little too erratic to be a great card in Limited. Next, we have Amulet of Safekeeping, which for 2 generic is a rare artifact. And it says, whenever you become the target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, counter that spell or ability unless its controller pays 1. And creature tokens get -1/-0. So this is a card that's meant to be a sideboard card for Constructed. It will not usually be relevant in this format, though there may be some weird corner cases where it is. Some decks may end up with enough creature tokens that it's worth it. People aren't generally going to be targeting you enough for the other part to be worth it. I'm going to give it a D-, though it may just deserve an F. Next, we're going to look at Arcane Encyclopedia, which for 3 generic mana is an uncommon artifact, and you can pay 3 generic and tap it to draw a card. Doesn't seem great to me. If the format turns out to be really slow, it'll be nice, especially in decks that are looking for artifacts anyway. But an upfront cost of 6 mana to draw that first card is steep, and there'll be lots of times where you play this and you just don't have the time to draw cards with it because your opponent played an actual creature on turn 3 instead of this thing. I think I'll play it when I really want artifacts, but avoid it otherwise. I'm giving it a D. Next, we have Chaos Wand, which for 3 generic mana is a rare artifact. You can pay 4 generic mana and tap it, and then target opponent exiles cards from the top of their library until they exile an instant or sorcery card. You can cast that card without paying its mana cost, then put the exiled cards that weren't cast this way at the bottom of that library in a random order. This is a hard one to judge. It's sort of random. It's sort of a Hearthstone-y feeling card, right? So I can see myself being wrong because of how erratic it can be. But I think it's pretty good. It does require a high mana investment. Like if this had been in Dominaria, it probably would have been insane. But the huge mana investment is a lot. And you are a little reliant on your opponent having spells, but most limited decks have 3 to 5 of those, and they're usually removal spells. It does ask for a lot of mana over time, but I think it's probably worth it. If you're using this like every couple turns to cast one of your opponent's removal spells, that's pretty good. It is a little clunky, but I think it's still strong enough that it's worth considering a first pick on, especially because it's colorless, and I think I'm going to give it a B-. Next, we have Crucible of Worlds, which for 3 generic is a mythic rare artifact, and you can play land cards from your graveyard. So this is a card that was included for non-rotating Constructed formats. It's a great reprint if you like Modern, and that's about all it is. It's not very good in Limited. So it's basically just an F in Limited. It's not going to do anything 99.99999% of the time, and maybe even less than that. We don't even have Evolving Wilds in this format. If we had something like that, maybe I would think about it, or the Memorials that we just had. But we don't have any lands in this format that really synergize with this. So it's not so good. So yes, an F. Next, we have Desecrated Tomb, which for 3 generic is a rare artifact. And it says, whenever 1 or more creatures leave your graveyard, create a 1/1 black-back creature token with flying. So this is a build-around, I guess, but I don't think it's really that easy to get there. There are ways to do it. Like, I guess I could see you end up in a deck that has like Macabre Waltz, Raise from the Dead, Bone Dragon. Like, you have to have a long list of cards that lets you move creatures around in your graveyard before this is even worth running, and I just don't think it's going to be that possible. I hope it is, because it's a really fun build-around, but I'm going to give it an F just because I think it's way too hard to build around. Next, we have Diamond Mare, which for 2 generic is an artifact creature horse at uncommon. It's a 1/3, and when it enters the battlefield, you choose a color. Whenever you cast a spell of the chosen color, you gain 1 life. So this is a cool design for Limited, mostly because it pushes you towards 2 different archetypes. I mean, it can be good in 2 different archetypes, both life gain and artifacts. Still, it's just a 2 mana 1/3 that is going to gain you like a few life a game, and that's not exactly special. I do think you know, it's a fine card. I think it's a solid C, but it's not anything incredible. Next up, we have Dragon's Hoard, which for 3 generic is a rare artifact. When it enters the battlefield under your control, you put a gold counter on Dragon's Hoard. You can remove a gold counter from it to draw a card, and you have to tap it to do that too. And you can tap it to add 1 mana of any color. So this is a strictly better Manalith, which we're going to get to later. But, you know, Manalith is already a decent card that you play when you need fixing. This provides fixing, and even without the help of other dragons, it can draw you a card. So that's nice. It's nice to be able to do both of those things. Then once you get dragons, it can get pretty strong. You know, and this is a nice card to help you splash like Elder Dragons. So there's definitely some synergy there to ramp you into bigger dragons. Definitely a nice card. But I don't think you first pick it just because not every deck's going to be in the market for something like this. But it is a good card. It's just a C+ though. Next, we have Explosive Apparatus, which for 1 generic is a common artifact, and you can pay 3 generic mana and tap it to sacrifice it and do 2 damage to any target. So a 4 mana upfront cost to do 2 damage to any target is pretty steep, but there is an artifact deck in this format, and I think that will help it see some play, and it's the kind of card that you're like, man, I don't have any removal. I guess I have to run Explosive Apparatus, and for that reason, I think it's pretty decent. Last time we saw it, it helped enable Delirium because it gave you an artifact in your graveyard, which is cool. But yeah, I mean, I think mostly you just play this in your artifact decks, or if you're desperate for removal. I'm going to give it a C-. Next, we have Field Creeper, which is 2 generic for a 2/1 artifact creature, Scarecrow at common. That's it. You'll run this in 2 situations. Your deck needs artifacts really badly, which probably means you're blue-white, or you're desperate for a 2-drop. That means that this is a D-, about as close to F as you can get without being completely unplayable. Next, we have Fountain of Renewal, which for 1 generic is an uncommon artifact. It says at the beginning of your upkeep, you gain 1 life. You can pay 3 to sack it and draw a card. So I think this is kind of okay. There is a life gain archetype and an artifact archetype, and it works well in both. Sure, gaining life doesn't have the biggest impact, especially only 1 a turn, but it does if you're in the life gain deck that can take advantage of every life gain trigger. Being able to eventually pitch this, though, for a new card is what I think keeps it from being, like, horrible. Still, you probably never run this in a deck that doesn't care about life gain or artifacts, and I think that means it's a D+. Next, we have Gargoyle Sentinel, who for 3 generic is a 3/3 gargoyle at uncommon. It's got Defender, and you can pay 3 generic, and until end of turn, it loses Defender and gains Flying. This is a solid creature every time we see it. It blocks well, and in the late game turns into a win condition. And that's a useful card for me. I'm going to give it a C. Next, we have Gearsmith Guardian, which for 5 generic is a 3/5 artifact creature construct at common, and it gets +2/+0 as long as you control a blue creature. I'm going to give this a build-around grade. I mean, you aren't going to be playing a 5-mana 3/5 artifact in your deck if it doesn't have a significant number of blue creatures. So I think that means it's like a D+ in a not heavy in blue deck. And if you're not blue at all, I just think you don't play this, period. In a blue deck, though, he gets to be pretty good. 5 mana 5/5s are pretty beefy and limited, and it happens to be an artifact. All that's nice, and I think it gets a C+ there. Next, you have Magistrate's Scepter, which for 3 generic is a rare artifact. You can pay 4 generic and tap it to put a charge counter on it, and you can tap it to remove 3 charge counters from it and take an extra turn after this one. Kind of a weird random reprint. I think it's from like Mercadian Masks. Not really one anyone saw coming. It's kind of a cool card, but it's too slow and limited. Overall, you invest a ton of time and mana to make this work. A total investment of 15 mana. Delivered across 3 turns to take an extra turn is steep. I feel like at best, that's just going to cancel itself out. Like, you basically time-walked yourself with all that mana you spent, and now you're going to get that turn back. So you may as well just not play this. I think it's an F. Next, we have Manalith, which for 3 generic is a common artifact, and it lets you add 1 mana of any color. This isn't the best fixing out there, but if you're not green, it's basically the best you're going to do. And that's always nice when you're trying to splash. The artifact type is relevant in this format too. It's a solid C. Next, we have Marauder's Axe, which for 2 generic is a common equipment, and equipped creature gets +2/+0, and the equip cost is 2. So we've basically seen this before. I think Torch Gauntlet most recently was functionally the same thing. We may have even seen this actual card before, but I don't remember. But not boosting toughness is kind of a problem for equipment since it makes your creature hit harder, but doesn't really help them survive a combat that they wouldn't have been able to anyway. Basically, you need a creature with an evasive ability to make this worth it. So if you have a bunch of flyers, maybe this becomes reasonable, but it's still not very efficient at equipping and things like that. It's not a great card. I'm going to give it a D+. Next, we have Mereor Golem, which for 7 generic is a 3/3 golem at uncommon, and when it enters the battlefield, destroy target non-land, permanent, and opponent controls. So the art on this is cool. The effect is cool. You know, the idea that a golem that basically just falls out of the sky and crushes stuff. Cool idea. Also, I think it's pretty good. A 7 mana 3/3 that just destroys a permanent is something you'll play all day. I really love the flexibility it has. I mean, usually you're going to want to kill a creature, but sometimes blowing up an enchantment or artifact will be better, and it's nice that this can do that. This does cost 7 mana, but it feels like 7 mana worth of card to me. I'm going to give it a B-. I think I'll feel okay about first picking it. Next, we have Millstone, which for 2 generic mana is an uncommon artifact, and you can pay 2 and tap it, and target player puts the top 2 cards of their library into their graveyard. So this is admittedly kind of hard to evaluate. This set doesn't seem to me like it has a lockdown kind of control deck that can draw the game out forever and win with this. Though if it does, it's probably blue-black. But that is a pretty hard thing to evaluate before actually playing the format. Chances are good, though, that this isn't worth it. There's a little bit of other mill cards that are around in blue, but I just don't think there's enough, and I'm not going to really believe that there's a mill deck in a format until, like, seeing is believing, because there's so frequently not possible. Despite the fact that most sets have some mill build around things, it's almost always not possible to win with mill, so I'm not super interested in Millstone. I'm going to give it an F for now. Next, we have Rogue's Gloves, which for 2 generic is an equipment at uncommon, and when you equip it for 2 mana, and when your creature deals combat damage to a player, you can draw a card. I don't like this a lot. It is really only worth putting on something evasive. Like, it's the kind of equipment that you already have to have a good creature for. What you really want your equipment to do is make any of your creatures good creatures. This doesn't even get close to doing that. There's no stats boost at all. If you have a bunch of flyers in your deck, it definitely gets better. Or evasive creatures in your deck, it definitely gets better. But I still don't like it very much, and I'm going to give it a D+. Next, we have Sigiled Sword of Valeron, which for 3 generic is an equipment at rare. The equipped creature gets +2/+0, has vigilance, and is a knight in addition to its other archetypes. And when it attacks, you get to create a 2/2 white knight creature token with vigilance that's attacking. So I'm a little disappointed this doesn't give toughness as a boost, but that, you know, that would make this better, of course, but I think it's still pretty good. Making a 2/2 knight with every attack is great, and can make sure that you have a steady stream of creatures to put this on. I think the card advantage the knights will give you makes this a decent piece of equipment, more than decent. I think it's even first pickable. Being colorless does give it some bonus points, and I'm going to give it a B-. Next, we have Skyscanner, which for 3 generic mana is a 1/1 artifact creature Thopter at common. It's got flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card. So obviously, a 3 mana 1/1 flyer isn't very good, but one that replaces itself is great, especially as an artifact. It isn't anything special, but you'll find yourself playing one of these a lot. It's good with sacrifice synergies. It's good with artifact synergies. I'm going to give it a C. Next, we have Transmogrifying Wand, which for 3 generic is a rare artifact, and it comes into play with 3 charge counters on it, and you can pay 1 and tap it to remove a charge counter. Then you destroy target creature. Its controller creates a 2/4 White Ox creature token, and you can only activate that ability anytime you can cast a sorcery. So this is a weird one that's kind of hard to review, but a cool one. I think the most powerful thing to do with this is to power down your opponent's creatures. Sometimes it'll be useful to use on your own creatures, depending on the board state. That flexibility isn't a bad thing, but sometimes it won't really do much on either side of the board. And after doing its magic trick 3 times, it becomes pretty useless. Still, I think this is playable in most decks, just not something you want to take early. I mean, you know, you don't actually get to kill any creatures, but the mana investment's pretty small, and you can use it to basically turn your opponent's bombs into nothing, and I think that's pretty nice. But still, not something you quite want to first pick. I'm going to give it a C+. That's our last artifact. Let's move into lands. So I have Cinder Barrens here, but this is sort of a stand-in for all 10 of the tap lands that are in this set. We have 1 for every color. They're all at common, and that's pretty awesome. That's some nice fixing, just land-based fixing that we have in this set. So these lands are all pretty good. They provide really good fixing. If you're in those color pairs, you always want to have these because they make your mana base so much better. I still don't think you take them super early, but you know, once you sort of realize what color pair you're in, starting to take fixing isn't a bad idea over, like, you know, C-level cards, because it's pretty nice to have. Makes your mana base a lot better. I think this is a C+. Like, all of these lands are probably about a C+. Nothing incredible, but they do definitely help your mana base. Next, we have Detection Tower, which is a land at rare. You can tap it to add colorless, and you can pay 1 generic and tap it. And until end of turn, your opponents and creatures your opponents control with hexproof can be the targets of spells and abilities as though they didn't have hexproof. So there is 1 creature in this set with hexproof. I guess there's also Chromium, who can turn itself into a hexproof, and Palladia-Mors. So maybe there's 3, sort of. 2.5 maybe, but 2 of them are mythic is the point. So there's not enough hexproof for this to be worth running usually. If you go up against an opponent that has like 4 Vine Mares, maybe you side this in, but that's just, it's not going to happen. I mean, if Vine Mare is an uncommon, it just won't happen. It just doesn't do anything in limited, really, and that makes this an F. It's just worse than a basic land because it doesn't produce mana of any color. Next, we have Reliquary Tower, which is an uncommon land. You have no maximum hand size, and it can tap to add colorless. Similarly, this basically does nothing in limited. You very rarely find yourself, having to discard down from maximum hand size in limited. And if you do, it's usually because you are getting mana screwed, basically. And Reliquary Tower is not really going to help you out very much there in that way because it only produces colorless. So, yeah, I don't think it's very good for limited either. I think it's another F. Okay, so our last card in the entire limited review and in this particular video is Rupture Spire. So Rupture Spire is an uncommon land. It enters the battlefield tapped. When it enters the battlefield, you have to sacrifice it unless you pay 1, and you can tap it to add 1 mana of any color. So this is fine. It's kind of annoying, between entering the battlefield tapped and having to pay 1 for it. That's pretty big cost, but it does provide nice fixing. I think I kind of like Manalith more just because it provides more synergy for like the artifact deck. But this is fine. I mean, I don't think you take it super early or anything, but if you're trying to splash, I think prioritizing these is a good idea. Overall, I think it's just like a C- though. So that does it for my limited set review for Core Set 2019. We've talked about all of the cards in the set now, and those are my thoughts about them for now. I'll be back, several weeks into the format, a couple months into the format with sort of my post-mortem discussion of what I got wrong. And, I always do that because it's interesting, helps us think more about limited going forward. And there's still more Core Set 2019 limited content to come, including draft videos here in a couple weeks. Thanks for watching.